Welcome to the Emerging Civil War Virtual Symposium. I'm Chris Mikowski, Editor-in-Chief of Emerging Civil War. Thank you so much for joining us in person and online. Before I introduce our next speaker, I just want to give a shout out to some folks who made today possible. First of all, our technical director, Chris White, Emerging Civil War's co-founder. Thank you so much for your work behind the camera, Chris. Also, thank you to our symposium coordinators, Kevin Pollack and Dan Welch. Unfortunately, because of the COVID pandemic, we had to postpone this year's in-person symposium, and all the work that Kevin and Dan did to get ready for that, we've postponed to next year. So tickets for that are available at this time, but they're also the ones who stepped up to help make today's virtual symposium possible. So thank you, Dan and Kevin, for your work. I'd like now to introduce our next speaker, Sarah Kay Bierle. She is the managing editor of Emerging Civil War. She's the one who's working behind the scenes to keep the blog up and going and make sure that all that free content is coming to you every day. Her work is absolutely invaluable to our organization. Sarah is the author of the Emerging Civil War series, Call Out the Cadet, from the Emerging Civil War book series, Call Out the Cadets, The Battle of New Market. But she is also at work on a biography of the gallant Pelham, and she's going to present some of her research associated with that book for us today. Sarah Kay Bierle.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. I'm not exactly sure when you will be viewing this, but I hope that you are safe and well. And we're going to go ahead and dive right into the history here. So as Chris said, I'm going to be sharing a little bit about some of the research I've been doing on the Stuart Horse Artillery and John Pelham, but we're going to take a much broader range on it. We're not going to get focused just on that unit or that artillery commander. We're going to look at a cavalry movement, a cavalry raid, and that is the Chambersburg Raid of 1862. So let's kick off the talk. We're the boys who rode around McClellan. Now, the Chambersburg Raid is part of the height of the Confederate cavalry legends in the East. This movement was ordered by Robert E. Lee, and it put the men and horses to the test. We'll be digging a little deeper into that. I usually like to give an outline of where we're going with the presentation. It's pretty straightforward today, and it's going to be some traditional military history. We're going to be looking at aspects of the long route that the cavalry took on the raid. We'll take a look at some of their civilian interactions, and then close it out by talking about the far-reaching repercussions of the raid itself. So I think it's a good idea to start with some stories about the people involved, and since we're going to take the high overview look today, we're going to talk about some of the leaders at the top. So we're going to start off with George McClellan, who should be on the far left of your screen. I'm hoping that it'll translate that way for you. So here's a little overview. Many of you might be familiar with him, but there also might be something new, or at least a good reminder as we're getting started here. So George McClellan was born on December 3rd, 1826. He entered West Point in 1842, graduating 4 years later in the famed class of 1846. In that class, he was graduated second out of 59. Due to his high ranking in his West Point class, he went into the Corps of Engineers, served under Winfield Scott in the Mexican-American War, and promoted to brevet first lieutenant and then captain shortly thereafter. After the Mexican-American War, McClellan returned to West Point to teach, and while he was there, he translated a French manual of bayonet tactics, which has perhaps a bit of irony because when it comes to Civil War history, don't normally associate McClellan with the bayonet. For his engineering service, he spent time at Fort Delaware, on the Red River, and looking for a route for the Transcontinental Railroad. He went to Europe, where he was the military observer for the Crimean War. In 1857, McClellan resigned from the U.S. Army and served as vice president and later president for railroad companies, giving him some background in organization and logistics. In 1861, when the Civil War breaks out, McClellan returns to the military, and he'll first serve in the Department of Ohio. On May 14th of that year, he commissioned as a major general in the regular army, so he's moved to the top very quickly. Campaigns in the Western Virginia area, he offers strategy on how the war could be won very early on, just in the opening days. And then he's summoned to Washington, D.C. 5 days after the federal troops suffered defeat at the First Battle of Bull Run. He arrives on July 26th and begins to form and train what will become the Army of the Potomac. On November 1st, 1861, McClellan takes over as General-in-Chief as Winfield Scott resigns. When concern was expressed about how much McClellan was taking on, he boldly proclaimed, "I can do it all." And part of his goal to do it all included a grand strategy for 1862. That involved the Peninsula Campaign, moving thousands of troops from the Washington and Alexandria area to the Virginia Peninsula. That movement started in March of that year, but by May 5th, they had only made it to Williamsburg. It's on the peninsula that McClellan has his first run-in with Jeb Stuart, the Confederate cavalry commander, and Stuart performs the Chickahominy Raid in June, which is his first ride around McClellan, but more on that in just a moment. The 7 days battles forces McClellan to retreat from Richmond, and eventually he withdraws from the peninsula. And there had been a lot of political wrangling, letters back and forth in that whole period, so he wasn't necessarily proving that he could do it all. On September 2nd, though, with Confederate troops starting to move northward, McClellan is called back and he'll command the fortifications of Washington and all the troops to defend the capital. Lincoln's cabinet was a bit worried about this decision, and they wrote down some of their disagreements, saying, quote, "Our deliberate opinion that at this time it is not safe to entrust Major General McClellan the command of any army of the United States." Privately, however, Lincoln said to his secretary, John Hay, "We must use what tools we have. There is no man in the army who can man these fortifications and lick these troops of ours into shape half as well as he. If he can't fight himself, he excels in making others ready to fight." During the Maryland campaign, McClellan did not move very quickly, but he did manage to fight the Battle of Antietam on September 17th, the bloodiest day in American history. The result of that battle forces the Confederates to retreat across the Potomac, enough that McClellan can claim a victory, enough that Lincoln can issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And once the Confederates are back across the river, McClellan settles down for some more waiting. President Lincoln visited the general at the very beginning of October. They took some famous photographs at that time, but it had little effect on McClellan's motivation or incentive to move a bit faster. Now, the gentleman on the far right of your screen is Alfred Pleasonton. I wanted to mention him because he's going to be the guy, spoiler alert here, who will have the best chance of stopping Jeb Stuart and the Chambersburg Raid. We'll get to that. Pleasonton was born on July 7th, 1824. His father, Stephen Pleasonton, was rather famous and had helped save National Archive documents when the British burned Washington, D.C. during the War of 1812. His dad also served as the 5th auditor of the U.S. Treasury and the superintendent of lighthouses from 1820 to 1852. Historic lighthouses pre-Civil War is kind of a little hobby of mine, so I had to throw that in there. Back to Alfred Pleasonton, though, he graduated from West Point in 1844, commissioned into the 1st U.S. Dragoons, and served in the territories of Iowa, Minnesota, and down in Texas. During the Mexican-American War, he promoted to 1st lieutenant for gallantry at the battles of Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma. In the mid-1850s, he served as his regiment's adjutant and also promoted to captain. Now, Pleasonton was in Utah Territory when the war began in 1861, and he travels back east with the 2nd Dragoons. Once he got back to Washington, D.C., Pleasonton tried to politic his way into a higher Army rank using his dad's old political connections, but it didn't work out very well for him. On August 3rd, 1861, he entered the 2nd U.S. Cavalry Regiment. The following year, on February 15th, he promoted to major. He did serve with McClellan's army in the Peninsula Campaign, but his time with the cavalry there has been described as unremarkable. On July 16, 1826, Pleasonton promotes to Brigadier General of Volunteers and moved to command a cavalry brigade in the Army of the Potomac. On September 2, 1862, he gets division command, which will hold for the Maryland campaign. Pleasonton is slightly wounded at Antietam, and he made really big claims that he'd done a lot of great things in the battle and was upset that he didn't get promoted to Major General. Now, at the very beginning of October 1862, Pleasonton and some of his cavalry crossed the Potomac at Shepherdstown and briefly occupied Martinsburg. But a couple hours later, Jeb Stuart drove him out. Pleasonton had ambition, and there were tests coming for him in the next weeks to see if he might be able to pass those tests and seek more of the command, promotion, and fame that he might have been seeking. And finally, we come to the officer in the center, James Ewell Brown Stuart, better known as Jeb Stuart. And he's the guy who kind of instigates the Chambersburg Raid and will carry it out. So quick overview on his life up to that point. He was born on February 6, 1833. He attempted to enlist in the U.S. military in 1848, but was told he was too young. So he spent 2 years at Emory and Henry College. Then in 1850, he received his appointment to the Military Academy at West Point. During Stuart's time there, Robert E. Lee arrived, actually in 1852, and served as the Military Academy's superintendent. Around the same time, Fitzhugh Lee, who would later command cavalry under Stuart during the Civil War, also arrived. Stuart was honored for his equestrian and cavalry skill during his time at West Point. He graduated 13th in a class of 46. He served in the U.S. Regiment of Mounted Riflemen in Texas, saw action in Kansas Territory when it was bleeding Kansas, and was wounded during a fight with Cheyenne warriors. In 1859, Stuart was in Washington, D.C., securing a patent for his saber hook. It's at that time that John Brown's raid occurred at Harper's Ferry, and Stuart joins Colonel Robert E. Lee and helps to identify John Brown and also signals the U.S. Marines to attack the engine house where Brown was hiding out. On April 22, 1861, 10 days after the firing on Fort Sumter, Stuart promotes to captain in the U.S. Army. He resigns, though, on May 3rd. On May 10th, 1 week later, he commissioned as a lieutenant colonel in the Virginia forces and helped organize the 1st Virginia Cavalry Regiment. He was promoted to full colonel on July 16th and worked closely with Thomas J. Jackson near Harper's Ferry, organizing and training troops. The Battle of First Bull Run is where he begins to highlight his skills with cavalry in addition to some of the picketing that he had done prior to that. He promotes to Brigadier General on September 24th, 1861, spends the autumn, winter, and early part of the spring training his cavalry and doing some innovative ideas with the concept of horse artillery. Stuart goes to the peninsula, fights in the Battle of Williamsburg, and is helping to cover parts of the Confederate movements in that peninsula campaign. After Robert E. Lee takes command, he asks Stuart to go scouting, and this will be the first ride around McClellan, also called the Chickahominy Raid. Stuart and his cavalry get more experience, notably in the Second Bull Run campaign, skirmishing in Northern Virginia, and then the invasion of Maryland in the autumn of 1862. So let's change the slides here. And on the screen, hopefully you're able to see that to the left, we have a map of Stuart's Chickahominy Raid. On the right, we have the Chambersburg Raid. So both raids are a ride around McClellan's army. And it's helpful to know a little bit about the Chickahominy Raid when we consider the planning for the Chambersburg Raid. So the Chickahominy Raid occurs between June 12th and 15th, 1862, right in the middle of the Peninsula Campaign. Stuart takes about 1,200 men and a detachment of 2 guns from the Stuart Horse Artillery. They ride approximately 150 miles, capture 165 Union soldiers, 260 horses and mules, and various supplies. Most importantly, they're able to confirm the information that Lee wanted to know, that McClellan's right flank was vulnerable. They faced no serious opposition. The Union cavalry was decentralized in their approach to trying to combat them a little bit. Stuart did clash with troops commanded by his father-in-law, though, so a bit of a human interest side there. 1 man is recorded killed in the Chickahominy Raid on the Confederate side. This launches Stuart and his cavalry into Confederate fame and Confederate legend, and he becomes part of the story of the defenders of Richmond and is really able to push the idea of the gallant cavalry and things like that. So we're going to fast forward on the timeline now to October 6th. The Battle of Antietam has been fought. As we've said, McClellan is waiting. Lincoln wants him to do something, but McClellan is still in waiting mode. October 6th, we know that Lee, Jackson, and Stuart are talking about another raid northward. It might have been on their minds before, but October 6th is the day that we can pinpoint those discussions happening. 2 days later, Lee sends orders to Stuart. They begin with these words: "An expedition into Maryland with a detachment of cavalry, if it can be successfully executed, is at this time desirable. You will, therefore, form a detachment from 1,200 to 1,500 well-mounted men, suitable for such an expedition. And should the information from your scouts lead you to suppose that your movement can be concealed from bodies of the enemy that would be able to resist it, you are desired to cross the Potomac and proceed to the rear of Chambersburg and endeavor to destroy the railroad bridge. Any other damage that you can inflict upon the enemy or his means of transportation, you will also execute." Lee goes on to issue some more detailed instructions, including the disruption of the railroad supply lines for McClellan's army, the importance of gathering information about Pennsylvania, the necessity to keep movement secret, and he says that taking hostages, if necessary, will be permissible. This is somewhat prompted by what Union General John Pope did in his summer campaigns in Virginia. Lee adds some concluding advice, saying, "Reliance is placed upon your skill and judgment in the successful execution of this plan, and it is not intended or desired that you should jeopardize the safety of your command or go farther than your good judgment and prudence may dictate." So as Stuart prepares his cavalry for this raid that they're going to make, his headquarters are at a country house known as the Bower, and his cavalry is encamped in the area nearby. The Bower belonged to Adam Stephen Dandridge, and the time that Stuart has his headquarters there is often written about as there were lots of parties, feasts, dances. It's almost a break from war, but Stuart's going to take a break from war to organize the Chambersburg Raid. On October 9th, just one day after he receives the instructions from Lee, he issues orders to his troops. "Soldiers, you are about to engage in an enterprise which, to ensure success, imperatively demands at your hands coolness, decision, and bravery, implicit obedience to orders without question, and the strictest order and sobriety on the march and in bivouac. The destination and extent of this expedition had better be kept to myself than known to you. Suffice it to say that with the hearty cooperation of officers and men, I have not a doubt of its success, a success which will reflect credit to the highest degree on your arms. The orders which are herewith published for your government are absolutely necessary and must be rigidly enforced. So then Stuart goes through and issues these directives of things that will and will not happen on this forthcoming raid. First off, top priority in Stuart's mind is capture horses. If you're going to have cavalry, you have to have horses. And they needed to be able to replenish those mounts. He did say that they would seize property from U.S. citizens and from government supply areas, but that receipts would be given so that those citizens could make claims to the federal government. No personal plundering was to be allowed. He then issued orders for how they would manage all these horses that they were going to capture. Any hostages that were taken were to be treated kindly. No straggling would be permitted in the column, and no property would be seized until they got to Pennsylvania. So Stuart did not want to be raiding horses or other supplies from the people of Maryland. Lee and the Confederacy were still trying to court Maryland to their side, and plundering from those people was probably not a good way to make friends. So all the horse collecting would have to wait until after they crossed the Mason-Dixon line. According to Henry McClellan, who served on Stuart's staff, 600 of the best mounted men were pulled from 3 brigades. So, or 600 from each. That's an easier way to think of it. So 600 from Hampton's, Fitz-Lee's, and Robertson's brigades. Now the generals who went along to command these detachments were Wade Hampton, Lee, and then Colonel William E. Grumble Jones. They go as the commanders of these 600s. Major John Pelham took 4 guns and crews from the Stuart Horse Artillery, 2 guns from his unit direct, and 2 that he pulled from other units. Around 2 p.m. on October 9th, the cavalry that is going to go on this raid begins leaving their camps and heading toward Hedgeville. Captain Thomas Logan of Company G, 12th Illinois Cavalry, he and his men were picketing the river within a mile of McCoy's Ford and Ferry site. Also, on Fairview Heights, there was a Union signal station and sentries that may have been able to see the Confederate movements toward the river. So Stuart and his cavalry secure the area around Hedgeville. They're still on the West Virginia side of the river. And at midnight, Stuart heads for the river to finalize the crossing point. Early on the morning of October 10th, it's a Friday, heavy fog settles in around the river. The Confederates secure the ford, but they don't completely surprise the Union pickets. Hampton's detachment leads the crossing. Meanwhile, civilians alert Captain Logan and his pickets. Logan decides not to engage, but he immediately notifies all the Union officers in the area. Confederates capture the signal station at Fairview, and then their column begins heading north for Pennsylvania. They cross the Mason-Dixon line into Franklin County, move through Blair's Valley, and it's at that point that they begin collecting horses. Now, along the way, Captain William Blackford recorded that he saw some of the troopers pillaging and feasting. On the other hand, Stuart claimed he never saw that. Capturing horses, as we've mentioned, was a goal that Stuart had in this raid. And there are a number of stories that come down to us about the process. Sometimes the Confederate troopers would go and tell the farmers they were from the U.S. government. They were taking their horses for the Union Army. And then when the farmers would start complaining about how they didn't like the federal government, the troopers would then say, well, oh, we don't like them either. So there's these good-humored back and forth conversations that we see between the civilians and the Confederates at this point. You also have receipts being written for later reimbursements, and then some of the troopers were trying to pay for the horses with Confederate money, which wasn't really welcome. The horses they were collecting in this area were heavy, more of a draft breed that were good for artillery, but not exactly what they were looking for cavalry operations. Now, there's a great story about something that happened with the artillerymen that are coming along under John Pelham's command. Somewhere along the way, they either trade or confiscate. Somehow they get a hold of large farmers' hats, the straw hats. but it's raining and it's drizzling on this day. So before long, the hats are all bent out of shape and drooping in these rather funny fashions. Stuart happens to see this detachment, and he doesn't think that fits the gallant image for his Confederate cavalry. So he gives Pelham a terrible time, saying that, "Oh, you've brought the farmers along." And it's said that for weeks afterwards, the units, or that artillery unit, went by the nickname the Farmers. Now, the first Union prisoner was taken in the area of Clay Lick, and this was Mr. Winger. He was the postmaster and an outspoken Union man. He will complete the whole Chambersburg Raid with the troopers and actually spend 6 weeks in Libby prison. The first major town that the cavalry column comes to is Mercersburg, Pennsylvania. They arrive in a light rain about 12 noon. Hampton arrives in the town. 2 of the cannons are parked in the town square. It's said that some of the Confederate column was wearing blue coats, and at first the civilians actually thought they were Northern troops. That soon changed because Union flags were torn down and shredded by these arriving raiders. Merchants refused to accept Confederate money, so the officers told the men to take what they wanted. One store lost 600 shoes or boots. Not all the soldiers were comfortable with this idea, though. The post office got raided, the mail and stamps taken, more hostages and prisoners were captured. They took a total of 9 in Mercersburg. Dr. Thomas Cray was a Presbyterian minister in the area, and he described the day, saying, "The town is in a greatly excited state, entirely at their mercy, and yet, though much excited, are calmer and more tranquil than would have been supposed. Such a raid as this brings war very near to us." Another minister described the behavior of the Confederates, saying, "They behaved very decently. They were gentlemen robbers." The people took it in good humor while keenly feeling the insult and humiliation. It was a marvel that 2,000 or 3,000 cavalrymen could cross the river in the face of an army of 200,000. After leaving Mercersburg, Stuart's column starts heading east through southern Pennsylvania. Now, Stuart had guides for this raid, young men who had grown up in southern Pennsylvania. Some of them had been involved in hunting escaped slaves prior to the war. Southern sympathies had drove them into Virginia, where they enlisted with the Confederate military, and then Stuart found out about their knowledge of the area and asked to use them as scouts. In Mercersburg, Captain Blackford said he captured a county map that was valuable for getting a better idea of the road systems. He took it from a sitting room, despite the glares of angry women. It was about 2:30 when the column left Mercersburg, and as I mentioned, they're heading east. Some of the farmers in the area are getting a little more knowledge that this Confederate raiding is happening. Some farmers hid about 25 horses in a stone quarry, which was located out in the middle of a cornfield, and managed to keep their horses safe from the Confederates. Near the town of St. Thomas, which is sometimes called Campbelltown, women rang the church bell to sound the alarm, and home guardsmen rallied to oppose the cavalrymen, and shots were exchanged. Thomas Billy Connor stood up to the cavalry in the middle of the road and refused to leave. Stuart and his officers took him prisoner into the town square, forced him to break his gun, and then told him he got to ride on a caisson for the rest of the day. He also would be sent to Libby prison and spend about 6 months there. Now, Chambersburg was an objective, and that was where the column was heading. They approached the city about 8 p.m. It's been raining all day. Chambersburg had been warned by telegraph that Confederate cavalry was in the area. Stuart accepted a flag of truce for negotiations, made General Hampton the military governor of Chambersburg, and positioned 2 of Pelham's guns over the town, giving them some idea of how the negotiation was going to go. About 75 Home Guard arrived at the Chambersburg courthouse. The Confederates gave the town 30 minutes to surrender and said that no private property would be harmed, only government officials would be detained. The Chambersburg civilians agreed, and the Confederates entered. However, they got one telegraph message out, and they sent it to the Pennsylvania governor, Governor Curtin, who then sent word to Secretary of War Stanton in Washington, D.C. Word is starting to spread outside of the region that Stuart is on the move and causing destruction. Meanwhile, in Chambersburg, the Confederates paroled the Union wounded. Meanwhile, escaped enslaved men, women, and children hid, fearful of being taken back to bondage by the Confederate raiders. The Confederates found that the Chambersburg Bank was empty and did more shopping in the stores of the area. One storehouse that had ammunition was burned. According to a Union soldier who was keeping track of events of the raid, the Confederates took 700 muskets, 400 pistols, 468 ammunition boxes, 200 uniforms, various sabers, and belts. Some of the supplies, which the Confederates took, the Union had captured from Longstreet during the Maryland campaign. More horses and more mules were rounded up. This Union soldier also mentioned that there were some African Americans who were captured and taken back to the South in slavery. Public buildings were burned with an estimated cost of about $100,000. Stuart spent time planting misinformation about his command, how many troops he had with them, and what his intentions were. He specifically told some Chambersburg civilians that he was heading for Gettysburg next. Stuart, to his officers, was starting to worry about how he would recross the Potomac since it had been raining all day. About 9 p.m., Grumble Jones sent men from the 2nd Virginia Cavalry 5 miles north to destroy the important Cumberland Valley Railroad bridge. However, those guys were not successful. There's 3 reasons why the bridge may not have got destroyed. First, the civilians might have convinced them not to destroy it. Second, the bridge might have been so wet it wouldn't burn. Or third, Lee and Stuart, in their reports, believed that the bridge was made of iron. There's a bit of a local history dilemma as to whether the bridge was wood or iron at that time, but the point of it is the bridge didn't get destroyed. On Saturday, October 11th, Stuart's column is getting ready to leave Chambersburg, and Stuart tells Captain Blackford his plan for getting back to the Potomac. And Stuart says he wants someone else to know the plan in case Stuart gets captured. As they leave Chambersburg, Marylanders are the guides. They're going to head back toward Maryland, and the column of cavalry is stretching 5 miles long over the roads. Meanwhile, Union General George McClellan is sending off units to try to intercept Stuart. Alfred Pleasonton got faulty information that Stuart was heading back to Mercersburg, and Pleasonton delayed his pursuit. One civilian woman, Miss Sally P. Horner, rode ahead of the Confederates toward Fayetteville, warning the farmers along the way. She later portrayed herself and wrote her own memory as a Civil War-styled Paul Revere. In Cashtown, the Confederates collected about 50 or 60 more horses, raided a few more stores. The Cashtown Hotel listed out the things they lost, which included 200 gallons of whiskey, 8 gallons of port wine, 10 gallons of Applejack, 25 bushels of oats, 16 halters, and 1 harness. They started moving toward Maryland after getting to Cashtown close enough to create a panic in Gettysburg and get Union authorities to think that was the next target. Fairfield was the last major town that the column goes through and raids. Again, taking about 30 stands of arms from that local armory, $1,000 worth of supplies from the stores. And it's about the time of Fairfield that a few Confederates are taken prisoner. At least one of them had a lot of information to share, leading to the question if he was disgruntled or if he was purposely captured to hand over maybe misinformation. The Confederate column crosses back into Maryland. And as they cross that state line, the orders for raiding and horse collecting come down. That has to stop. They pass through Emmitsburg about sunset on October 11th, and there the ladies came out and welcomed them. Just after Stuart's column comes through, only about an hour between, Rush's Lancers, a Union unit, arrives, and he'd missed them by an hour. Fatigue was setting in Stuart's column. Troopers worried about falling asleep, falling off the horses, and breaking their necks. Blackford recorded a glimpse of what it was like in the night column. It is no small tax upon one's endurance to remain marching all night. During the day, there is always something to attract attention and amuse, but at night there is nothing. The monotonous jingle of arms and accoutrements mingles with the tramp of horses' feet into a drowsy hum all along the marching column, which makes one extremely sleepy, and to not be allowed to sleep is exquisite torture. Many of the men went fast to sleep on their horses, and snores, loud and long, could be heard all along the column. Near Waynesboro, Maryland, Stuart captured a Union recruiting officer in his buggy, who was very surprised to run into this column of cavalry. Meanwhile, Alfred Pleasanton was just 5 miles to the west of the column, and Stuart changes directions again, heading further east and continuing south. Near Urbana, Maryland, Stuart took a detour and a 30-minute break to go impress the New York Rebel and other young ladies that he had met several weeks earlier at the Sabres and Roses Ball, which had happened during the Maryland campaign in that village. As dawn comes on October 12th, Stuart's columns, which had been moving on parallel roads, reunite. Meanwhile, Union Brigadier General Stoneman was guarding all the fords near Poolesville. They had gone 65 miles from Chambersburg, and they were just 5 miles from the Potomac. The cavalrymen in Stuart's column were changing their horses out with the captured animals in an attempt to keep moving as quickly as possible. That morning, October 12th, Alfred Pleasanton is heading for Stuart, and he's aiming for the mouth of the Monocacy River, thinking that that is where Stuart will try to cross. However, Stuart summoned his local experts and decided to slip toward a lesser-known location. It's called White's Ford, and he planned to arrive by a route that would trick any observant Federals. Now, the photo that you're seeing of White's Ford was kindly provided by some colleagues of mine in Emerging Civil War, but they wanted me to mention that when they took this photo, it was very, very flooded. So the river would have been lower when Stuart's crossing cavalry and those few artillery guns over. So we didn't want you to think it was quite that high when you see the photo, but it was what we had to work with at this season. So White's Ford. Alfred Pleasanton, he had made quite a long march as well. He'd moved 70 miles in 24 hours. He begins to move some troops onto the Poolesville and Monocacy Road. At that time, he runs into Stuart, or I guess more correctly, Stuart runs into him. The Union troops try to charge, there's confusion, there's a situation with friendly fire, which allows Stuart to pull back and reorganize. He sends Major Pelham to fire the cannons on the Union troops. This leads Alfred Pleasanton to believe that Stuart is going to fight and force his way forward. Pleasanton begins to deploy cavalry and infantry, and then he waits for 2 hours. At one point, Pleasanton moves forward and he converses with Federal cavalry. They turned out to be Confederates who fired on him. Meanwhile, the other cavalry detachments, Confederate cavalry, use a display of force and a trick to clear the Union guards from White's Ford. Those detachments are ordered by their officers not to let the horses drink, but to plunge into the river and get across. The first 2 detachments cross. Then Pelham begins moving his artillery guns, covering the retreat. Finally, he sent all but 1 gun across, with 1 gun positioned near Lock 26 on the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. He covers the last of the cavalry crossing over and then manages to get that final gun across the river also. The raid had been 130 miles. The cavalry heads for Leesburg. Stuart's still worried that the Federals will pursue. From Leesburg, he heads west again, returning to the Bower, which was his headquarters. He reported that he lost 1 man wounded and 4 captured. There were 30 Pennsylvanians who crossed the Potomac back into Virginia with Stuart. Those Pennsylvanians taken as hostage were sent to Libby Prison and were eventually exchanged for Confederate prisoners. Along his raid, Stuart had captured and detained many others, but he paroled them and didn't take them south. Only the 30 went with him. The raid itself had been risky, and in the planning, they had banked on McClellan's slowness and Stuart's speed. Alfred Pleasonton had almost messed up those calculations. Results for the Confederates included the destruction or confiscation of a minimum of $250,000 US dollars, or amount of property, They brought back at least 1,200 horses, but some of the realists kind of questioned if that was worth it, because the horses that came back with them were so tired from having been exchanged and used during the raid that those horses were weary and now in need of rest. They brought back, of course, arms, supplies, clothing, and other valuable supplies for the Confederacy. Meanwhile, on the Union side, the officers started playing a blame game. Started off with Alfred Pleasonton and George Stoneman blaming each other for not capturing or stopping Stuart. Then George McClellan blamed both Pleasonton and Stoneman for not following his orders. Meanwhile, General-in-Chief Halleck blamed McClellan and on October 14th said, quote, "The President has read your telegram and directs me to suggest that if the enemy had more occupation south of the river, his cavalry would not be so likely to make raids north of it." That was followed by another telegram on October 24th from the President. "I have just received your dispatch about sore-tongued and fatigued horses. Will you pardon me for asking what the horses of your army have done since the Battle of Antietam that fatigue anything?" Someone asked Lincoln what he was going to do with McClellan. Lincoln replied with one of his humorous stories. "When I was a boy, we used to play a game 3 times round and out. Stuart has been round him twice. If he goes round him once more, gentlemen, McClellan will be out." But Stuart didn't get a chance for a third time around McClellan. Lincoln ordered McClellan's removal from command on November 5th, 1862. 4 days later, McClellan wrote to his wife, "Those in whose judgment I rely tell me that I fought the battle splendidly," he's referring to Antietam, "and that it was a masterpiece of art. I feel I have done all that can be asked in twice saving the country. I feel some little pride in having, with a beaten and demoralized army, defeated Lee so entirely. Will one of these days, history will, I trust, do me justice." Which is a very nice sentiment, but I question if Lee was entirely defeated, since Stuart took 1,800 men around McClellan's army. Now, Stuart cannot and should not be given full credit for McClellan's dismissal, but the Chambersburg Raid did help to seal McClellan's fate. Confederate outcomes included a boost in morale, the idea that successes would continue with speed and using the unexpected. They brought back numerous supplies, and tactically, we see a flexibility in Stuart's movements. As he realizes Union cavalry starting to close in on him as he's returning to the Potomac, he alters routes, he makes decisions quickly, and perhaps that experience would influence what he was trying to do in the Pennsylvania campaign the following summer, which of course includes the Battle of Gettysburg. The Chambersburg Raid can be seen as offering a foreshadowing for the cavalry's future in the East. Pleasonton was behind this time, but in the following year, he would be part of the Battle of Brandy Station and the rise in the turning point for cavalry warfare. Personally, Pleasonton's politicking did not help his own advancement, and he did not secure stunning battlefield successes, but he was part of the rise of the Union cavalry. In the future, particularly in 1863 and beyond, Stuart would have to fight much harder for his successes, and the Chambersburg Raid marks one of the final joyrides of his cavalry. A song that is often referenced in Stuart's cavalry or reminiscence by his officers is the song called Join the Cavalry. And it was written, it's associated with Stuart's headquarters, and it's a very repetitive song. There's different verses and they just kind of repeat. But it starts off with, "We're the boys who rode around McClellan," which very well could reference the Chickahominy Raid. Then there are 3 verses specifically dedicated to the Chambersburg Raid. "We're the boys who crossed the Potomac," "We're the boys that rode to Pennsylvania," and then there's another verse that talks about Pennsylvania Dutch girls, Germans, handing out bread to these soldiers in Pennsylvania. With the 3 out of the 5 traditional verses of this song dealing with the Chambersburg Raid, it gives us clues into how Stuart and his men viewed their successes and wanted to immortalize it in song. It gives us clues in how they wanted to be remembered. They wanted the glory image. But we have to remember that there's more to the story, including those civilian interactions, the overarching questions relating to the Civil War in the larger sense, and the military ethics that are also important to consider. Thank you.